As we're gathering back together, I'm excited to be able to introduce our second session of the morning. We're going to be blessed to be led by Dr. Jason Biasi and Reverend Matt Miovsky. Jason and Matt have written a book together. We showed it to you just before the break. It's called The 8 Virtues of Rapidly Growing Churches, and they make a great team. Dr. Biasi is a professor at the Vancouver School of Theology, studied at places like Davidson College and Duke University. We can have a round of applause for Duke, that's right. Moment of personal privilege. All right, and then Matt has an advanced math degree and played football at Washington University in St. Louis. Is that right, Matt? Maybe? Okay. And went to Candler School of Theology. These are two just amazing leaders in our connection. This morning I was reading an article. Matt's church, The Gathering in St. Louis, is the third fastest growing church in all of United Methodism. Jason's one of the real revered teachers in our connection and professors of just how to be practitioners of what we believe in. And I believe that we are going to be blessed by them. So wherever you find yourself, whether here at the live site or at the satellite site, would you join me in welcoming Jason and Matt? Thanks, guys.
I didn't know until just now that Jason was a revered professor. So I just learned that about my friend.
And you notice they applauded for Duke and not for your
not
schools.
A sound for Emory.
I mean, you played football and you didn't even get cheered for that. That's,
yes. All right.
So Matt and I really believe in creative friendship. It's why we wrote this book together, because we found as we talked to one another that one of us would bring up something and the other would be like, yeah, it's not like that at all. And then we'd have to get busy kind of rewriting what we had received. And it just occurred to us, this is a very Methodist thing, where you're supposed to let someone into your life in a way where they have like veto power over what you said. But you do it because you love them, and you know they love you, and you're pursuing Jesus together. And so we just found it was so much more interesting to write together than it would have been to write by ourselves.
Yeah, so in some ways, just us, I think I got called first to come here, and I said, well, we should do this together, since it's about team preaching, and I guess more specifically, or more generally, how we draw other voices into our preaching, because most of us are still in situations where we stand up front most Sundays. Some of you, it's more Sundays than others. And so what we wanted to do today is pretty simple. I want to give you a little backdrop to kind of our friendship and the book. We're going to really quickly just sort of introduce you to the 8 virtues because they set the stage really for us getting more specific about the preaching moment and especially the idea of drawing other voices into your teaching and into your preaching. So the idea for this book, and actually the time that Jason and I met, there was a Festival of Homiletics in Georgia, or in North Carolina.
You travel
sorry.
too much, man.
I know. In Raleigh, and we met there. We were both preaching, and after we got done preaching, we went out afterwards. And Jason, who, if you don't know this, is amongst many things also a journalist, and used to be a writer for the Christian Century, and occasionally still has articles there. But he was really curious about something that he had read or discovered, or I don't remember how you found it, but that there were 5 United Methodist churches that were started in the past 10 years that grew to over 1,000 in worship. It was something like that, and you kind of listed them off there. You know, Olu Brown at Impact Church in Atlanta, and Jacob Armstrong at Providence Church in Nashville, and Adam Weber at Embrace Church in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and then The Gathering in St. Louis, and Res downtown in Kansas City. And Jason was just like, hey, I'm curious about this. I'm kind of want to interview these different people, and I'm thinking of writing a profile. And that was probably the first time I said, that's a bad idea. I mean, you shouldn't do that.
You really did.
A bad idea.
Boring. No one will read it.
Don't write profiles of 5 churches that have grown a lot. Nobody wants to. Everybody will read this book with contempt in their heart. I mean, do you all ever feel? I feel that way. I go to a conference, somebody tells me how great their church is. It makes me feel like my church is awful, I'm inadequate, I'm never going to be able to do this, and I leave angrier at them and God than when I went to the particular conference. I said, I don't think you should write that book. I said, and then he said, well, there's something here. And so through a conversation, we kind of on the back of a napkin literally sketched out a different idea. Wouldn't it be interesting, though, if we did interview those churches and more, other churches, that seem to be doing something different than most of the churches around them. And the different thing is they're growing, and they're growing pretty rapidly. And what's going on there? Because that's a question I'm interested in. What's going on there? Because that's weird to see a church that's growing really rapidly. You know, we're not used to that.
Yeah, and there's a kind of divine whimsy to it, too, in the sense that, like, it's a miracle, right? Like, you can't control miracles. You can't summon them up. That would mean we were, conjuring some other sort of deity than the living God of the Bible, right? So early on, Matt, at the end of our interviews with these 5 pastors, would say, all right, now here's a question that's a little weird. Did you have any early miracles when you got started? Like something you couldn't explain that then became part of your mythology as a church? And every time they said, you know what, we did. Nobody has asked me that question. Here's the thing that happened that we couldn't have planned, that like only God could have dropped on us. And I love that because I had originally presented Matt with a kind of skepticism of rapidly growing churches. I said, yeah, Andy Crouch says anytime a church grows, ask where the highway opened up, right? Like it's only because some traffic pattern moved through. And Matt was like, yeah, fine, but plenty of churches blow those opportunities. Like, you don't automatically grow because people move in. You have to give them something, some reason to come. And the one who gives them something is really God. So so that's where we tried to get away from. Here are things you can do to make this outcome result. The main thing you can do for a miracle is pray, hope, and then it comes from over here, not from over here where you were looking for, right?
Yeah.
Sorry, I jumped into chapter 1.
No,
We've never spoken together on this, so
yeah,
this is our first.
So, but to jump in and to move into it, so what we decided to do instead is he just started, he asked the question, well, what do you think makes some churches grow? I mean, what is it? And I said, I don't know. I really don't know. And so what we started to do is sketch out hypotheses, like, well, maybe it's this, and maybe it's this, and maybe it's this. And we got to, 15 or so of these things. And we said, wouldn't it be interesting if we called and interviewed churches, and then we looked for these things, or maybe some that we didn't name. We cross off the list aspects of their growth that were highly contextual, which might sound weird, but there are just certain reasons for certain churches to grow that aren't easily applicable or transferable to other places. And they didn't feel like the kind of thing and we said, let's see if there's some virtues that are true in every single situation. And we tried to get a diverse voices, and admittedly, there were opportunities to do better in that regard, but we did look at churches that were in cities and in suburbs and then in more rural locations. We looked at churches that were led by men and led by women. We looked at churches that were primarily white, primarily black. I mean, we looked kind of across the spectrum and said, regardless of contextual matters, is there anything that's true in all of these different situations, as varied as they are there some virtues that are present all the time? And after the interviews, we came away with 8. Some were on our list, some kind of cropped up actually in our conversation, and that's what we decided to write about. And if there was a subtitle to this book, I put it on there, the subtitle to the talk, 8 Virtues of Rapidly Growing Churches and What Churches of All Sizes Can Learn from Them. Because I found that as I was doing these interviews, even though the gathering was one of the subjects, just one of the interview subjects, I was like, oh yeah, I've forgotten about that. Oh yeah, I need to be more attentive to that. Oh yeah, I knew that in my head, but I had let that kind of slip out of my practice or focus within my church. And so what we wanted to do really quickly is just give you the 8. You can obviously read more about them. I've used this book already with my leadership team, my board, almost like in an evaluative way. Like, hey, how are we doing here? And how are we doing here? And how are we doing here? Go ahead, Jason, before I click on.
One thing that strikes me is a lot of megachurch pastors are like kind of rock star people who don't have time for like normal people, right? So they kind of emerge from the curtain at time, and then they leave before they go to church like Michael Jordan goes to the movies, right? It just strikes me with Matt, he's got a kind of curiosity about stuff, and he's willing to give his stuff away, and then listen when people say, yeah, it's not really like that. Here's this other thing. And then he'll adjust and say, oh, all right, let's do that instead. So it's a kind of model for working in teams for me, right? Which is what every church person has to do. You give your stuff away, and then you get it back in some form that could be highly revised, right? And that can be painful, right? Because in preaching, you've given away your soul, right? You've ripped open your rib cage, and they criticize the beating heart in there, right? I mean, I know why we don't like to do that, but actually it's essential for any ministry to say, I think this, what do you think? And then really listen, because if you don't listen, they won't answer, or they'll only answer once, right? But it's, again, a deeply Methodist thing. We don't have all the answers. We're supposed to be approaching Christ together, watching over one another in love. So this one sociologist that I cite in the book says he's interviewed presidents and people in Congress and millionaires and billionaires and philanthropists. He says the two hardest people to get on the phone are Hollywood actors and megachurch pastors. And it's for the same reason. They both have nothing to gain and everything to lose, or so they think. It's actually the opposite of the way we're supposed to be as Christians. Nothing can take away the thing that matters most, which is Christ. And so we can be fully open. Anyway, so I'm just grateful for the chance to see you in action that way.
Yeah.
I revere you.
Yeah.
You're welcome. And you're red. That's awesome. Oh, that's just lovely. All right, go ahead. First chapter.
Moving on. So I thought we'd give these to you really quickly. We can come back to them in the Q&A time, but we want to move then pretty quickly to this idea of preaching and how some of what we learned influenced the way that we see preaching, because there were all sorts of, as you might imagine, one of the things that I wanted to know about as a person who has to preach a lot is how do you do preaching? And tell me about that. And I will say more about this at the end, but I found out something really interesting that it surprised me, and that is the bigger the church, the more preaching was a team and collaborative effort.
Right.
I thought it would be the opposite. The bigger the church, the more you had kind of the prophet on the mountain mentality. Somebody goes away and brings it back, and that was false. But, okay, so the first virtue, rapidly growing churches believe in miracles and act accordingly. This is what Jason was
I already kind of spoiled
into.
your reveal.
No, that's
that
okay. I kind of had a hunch about this, that of course this makes sense. That why does a church grow? Well, God, I think ultimately the Holy Spirit moves in a particular way, and it's hard. We don't know where that comes from. We don't know where it goes. You can't bottle it and sell it to somebody. You can't replicate it with 7, 8, 9 strategies. I mean, it's just a miracle. And I have to tell you that when I talk to some of these pastors, I'd love to ask that question. Tell me, were there miracles that happened? And there were just things that happened. And I have to confess to you that at first, when they all kept affirming this, I thought, this is what's the best way to put it? This is the most deflating idea I've ever heard in my life, because it was deflating to me because if it's a miracle, if growth is a miracle and the Holy Spirit just does it, that sounds discouraging to me, because that means that maybe the Spirit just passed me by. I mean, maybe the Spirit just passed my church by.
Because that happens all the time in the Bible. People ask for the Holy Spirit and God's like, no, sorry, I'm busy.
I mean, how do I do anything then? And then there was a turn for me when I was writing this chapter, and it was this, that I have a deep belief the Holy Spirit is already at work right in your context, right in your church, and that God actually wants to produce miracles. God is at work actually knitting together miracles right in your midst. Mm-hmm. And here is the biggest difference between the pastors that we interviewed and I think a lot of other pastors that I talked to. These pastors actually had the audacity to not only believe that, but then to act accordingly. Yeah. In other words, they treated their context like God is doing something miraculous here. Something huge is going to happen here. And therefore, my job is to just figure out what it is that God is doing and do everything I can to just to kind of help usher that thing in. And so what I found out is they would do and say and ask for crazy things. They would do and say and ask for crazy things. Why? Because they actually believed God was going to bless them with a miracle. And then I met a lot of other pastors who, I read somewhere, it's called, you say people's no's for them. Do you ever do that? Like, you want to ask something bold, and no, that's too big. I'm gonna look stupid. I want to ask that guy for $1 million, but no, that's crazy. I want to ask that really busy woman. She's like a lawyer at a top law firm and stuff, but she's really great. I want to ask her to serve like 5 hours. There's no way she'll ever do it. It's just way too busy to get someone that capable. I need to search for the, sort of mediocre folks who might actually have the time to do something in my church. Whatever it is. we you all know what I'm talking about, right? We do this in our head. Like, I want to go for it, but God, rejection hurts, and I just can't. But these pastors, what was different is they just didn't do that. They believed God is producing a miracle. Somewhere God is going to do a miracle, and my job is to figure out what it is. And so what they would do is they would ask at a much higher rate than most pastors. And I learned that they had one skill that a lot of us really struggle to have, and that is they had a high tolerance for hearing no, for rejection. They had a high rejection tolerance, meaning, they would ask crazy things. And guess what happens? When you ask crazy things, do you know what you're going to hear more than anybody else? You're crazy. That's dumb. You're stupid. No. But if you ask 100 times for crazy things to happen, 99 times people will tell you no, but guess what? Ding, ding, ding. Can't win if you don't play. One time, somebody will say, yeah, I'll quit my high-powered job to come work in a church. Sure, I'll give you $1 million. Sounds fine. Sure, I'm a recording artist, but I don't mind playing in your church a couple times a month if that's what you need. And those are the stories. And then those in the mythology of a church, that becomes the miracle story. Here's the thing I discovered. Now I'll give it up because we can't talk this long about every one of them. I'm no math major.
This one's a really
good one. This isn't going
to
to work out.
You were a math major.
I know. I understand. What was I talking? What say?
Sorry, you were rolling into your last crescendo.
I know.
Derailed.
Here's the thing. For me, what this did is it gave me boldness. Boldness to actually believe what the Bible has told me over and over again, and that is that God is a living God. God is present right where you are. The Holy Spirit is moving. God is already at work doing ministry. Miracles are in the making, and we have to act as if we serve a God who is capable of miracles even in our midst.
And it sort of clarifies what the pastor's job, too, is, right? Like, you have to develop eyes for those things and narrate what's happening and retell the story as many times as you can so that others develop the same eyes for those things. Yeah. It's an ability to see. So I was with Elisa Lassiter at Capitol Hill Methodist in Washington yesterday, and she just kept hitting me with stories of this person's life turned around, and they were on drugs, and now they're leading here, and they're in this Bible study, and they are happily married. And this other person, they were a high-dollar person on Capitol Hill, and they met Jesus, and instead now they run our breakfasts because they meet Jesus and the poor. And about the 12th story, I was like, so you think this is like a coincidence? These people just happen to turn up? She's the kind of person who collects these stories. And what happens is the more she tells the stories, the more they happen to other people. Because that's contagious. That's the best sort of benevolent contagion. Because people say, I'd actually like a life worth living. Capitol Hill's not giving me that. And actually, money will kill you if you don't have a life worth living. So I think, yeah, I'll do that. But that's our job, is to be on the lookout and then name it and tell the story. And the word mythology, it becomes part of the mythology that gathers a people. It's the truest myth, right? That God is always after people who are totally broken, right? And piecing everything back together.
So just be willing to be told no more than you currently are being told no.
Youth group dating is good practice.
More cool
for this.
Things will happen if you raise your number of no's. Okay.
Yeah.
Next virtue. Virtue 2, rapidly growing churches integrate new people quickly. Connections is a question they're always asking and never done answering. This we found is true in all churches. And you can look around and you can think that these churches grow because of preaching or really great polished worship or something like that. Not true. A lot of churches have really good worship. There are a lot of good preachers. The churches aren't growing. The churches we found that are growing are constantly obsessing over how do we connect people. Constantly, and here, this is encouraging. The last one I said was discouraging, the miracles one. This one's encouraging. These churches, not one church ever said, and I've since learned, not one church ever, I said, what are you good at? And they'd name certain, we got generosity, we're good at worship, we do a pretty good job with kids ministry. Not one church said, we are great at connections and discipleship. And you know what I learned? This is something that's puzzling every single church. How do we connect people? Do we have a high bar, low bar? High expectations, low expectations? Do we start out, you all have asked this question. You've gone back and forth. Do we have a membership class that's, the catechesis of the ancient church? It's 48 years long and you get in on year 49. Or do we, is it a one-night thing in the fellowship hall? Like, how do we do this? And every church is obsessing over this and never quite answering it. This gave me great hope. Do you know why? Because at the gathering, it's always a mess. And we're always questioning what we just came up with. Mm-hmm. We're always trying it. We see how it works and how it doesn't work. And then we have to revise. And so what we found out is, and this is encouraging to you, if you're not currently obsessing over how you connect people and how you think about discipleship, because that's really what this is about. It's not just connecting new people, but then how do we disciple them? If you're not constantly asking questions like, is our current discipleship process broken? Is it working? Does it connect people? Have we thought about it in a long time? What should we do? What we're doing is not working. If you're not having any of those conversations, you should go back and create a crisis in your connections and discipleship process. Because what we learned in rapidly growing churches is they were constantly looking at how to connect and disciple people. This was at the forefront of what they were thinking about day in and day out.
Jorge Acevedo's language was, he said, our staff are locking ourselves in little dark rooms, banging our heads, begging God for help and how to connect people. So his story was that they had a ministry that has fed tens of thousands of people. They've had 1,000 people come to Christ through this ministry, and they're going to sell the whole thing for $1 million loss because they said of those 1,000 people that we had commit to Christ, we couldn't find any of them. Not a one of them was being discipled in any of our systems. On Methodist math, that is a loss, and you should stop doing it. You see that? Conversion without discipleship is not a net gain on Methodist math. In the 18th century, John Wesley was not the greatest preacher. It was George Whitefield by a mile. Everyone acknowledged that. But Whitefield, looking back over his life, said, you know what? I don't see any fruit. You know who has fruit? That John Wesley guy who wasn't that good a preacher. He didn't say it that explicitly. But Whitefield said, my work is like a rope of sand. It looks like a rope and you can pick it up and it just disintegrates in your hand. In other words, Wesley's work was like a rope that you can save a life with, because it tied people together in disciplined small groups. That's the genius of our movement, right?
Yep.
All right.
You're
Number three.
Virtue
I'm up.
three.
All right. Rapidly growing churches love the local, have planters and pastors that are from the community in which it's located or deeply rooted in that community. Now, this was one that I brought up with Matt over the napkin, and I said, a lot of these mythologies have a certain avuncular pastor in a Hawaiian shirt cruising into Orange County with no money and no friends, and telling the gas station attendant at the first place he stops, you're going to be the first member of my new church. I'm not naming names. And Matt said, yeah, that never happens. Nobody cruises into some town cold and starts a church with strangers. It's not how it works. It's not how it works with Rick Warren either. He came with money and blessings and training, and somebody raised him up and anointed him and taught him Sunday school and told him he was a planter and sent him to a place with resources and other people. So even he tells the story wrong. Rob Bell says, yeah, it was weird. We started in a mall, and like all these people turned up, and I don't know where they came from. I'll tell you where they came from. You're sending church 600 people with you. That's not a miracle. That's smart church planting. Okay, that's not a plant. That's a large church in Methodism. Anyway, now, they both grew amazing things out of that, so don't let me take anything away from them. But the way they tell the story is of the solo genius parachuting into town. That's not how it works. So we found with these churches, they were all planted decades before they were planted. That is, there were some deep local roots that somebody either had or was grafted into. So it's not that you have to grow up in a place to plant a church there, but it sure helps. So Matt's planting in a place where he went to college, where he knows people, where little pieces of his life sneak up behind him and kiss him on the cheek right when he needs it, right? It's kind of a sweet image,
it.
right?
I would never describe it that way, for the record.
Jacob Armstrong tells the story that, like, in Mount Juliet, Tennessee, fastest growing suburb in the United States, every single school has some church plant in the cafeteria and the auditorium every single Sunday, right? All hipsters and skinny jeans. So Jacob is talking to this principal at the last sorriest school that doesn't have anyone because the space is terrible, right? And he's trying to tell her our vision, and here's what we want to do, and we'll help out volunteering, and you really want us in your school. And she goes, wait a minute, I know you. Your brother dated my daughter. And Jacob was like, was he nice? And it turns out he was. Now, I don't know how to go back and make up for your siblings' dating misdeeds in a way that could be overcome if the answer was no. But they got exactly what they wanted. There was a way in which his being local lent a kind of credibility, right? And he says every week somebody comes up and says, wait, my friend coached you in Little League, right? So you see what I'm saying? That the sort of I parachuted into town knowing nobody is actually not only untrue, it's a massive disadvantage. Now, not all these pastors came from where their church has grown. So Olu Brown came from a small town in Texas. He still has this lovely drawl to him that's not very Atlanta. But here's what he did. He married a woman named Farah, who worked for a little startup in Atlanta called Coca-Cola, another one called Home Depot. She's the deep roots in Atlanta. Her family goes way back in the church that helped plant Impact Church, Cascade United Methodist. So Olu, like Gentiles into Israel, was grafted into a tree that was much older than he is. Scott Krostek grew up in Detroit, very different than Kansas City, although they both have questionable American League baseball teams. So he got busy very fast through his small group getting to know Kansas City. And his small group was stocked full of people who'd loved Kansas City for generations, not just decades, right? And so if you're going to plant in a place, you have to become as local as you can, as fast as you can. Be absolutely, ridiculously in love with your place, right? We still have a little bit of a Gnostic tendency in Christianity to speak as though place doesn't matter, to speak in universals. But God saves the world through one family with names and addresses. Like the wrong family, the unlikely family, right? That's the only people God chooses. God saves the world through an unmarried Jewish teenager who's pregnant and shouldn't be from nowhere, right? Like God has this thing for the particular. And we just found that over and over again in these churches.
I'll tell you, in a really rubber meets the road way, we have to fall in love with the places we're appointed. I realize we're appointed. But I think we all in this room know we can be in a place and not really be in a place.
Yep.
We can do that for years. Or we can be in a place and be there and love it, like we're going to live there forever. Even if we don't want to and we don't intend to, we have to, go in with that mindset. I think we have to love the places that we are. And I'll hear this all over the place. Matt, we're thinking of starting a church. I'm thinking of doing this. But I live 20 miles away. Do you think it's okay if I stay here, even though I'm appointed there, I'm going there? And I tell them every time, I can't tell you what to do, but I'll tell you, I've never met a church that's grown rapidly when a pastor, no matter what kind of office hours you keep, a pastor just doesn't live in the place that they're trying to serve. So that's all I'll say about that one.
I got one more thing on this.
Number 4, you got to move on.
I know. Jacob Armstrong says that there's nobody is from Mount Juliet, Tennessee. Everybody moved there from somewhere else. And so his being local makes new people trust him in some weird way. Because people actually want a history if they don't have one. Right? So that's another piece about loving the local. All right, so 4. Sorry, I definitely wasn't a math major. So rapidly growing churches are unapologetically evangelical. They put a disproportionate amount of time, energy, and resources in sharing Christ with new people and inviting them to church. Now, in our weird day, the word evangelical has become kind of a political word, right? So translate if you want. I like the biblical description. They're people who fear the Lord. They take God seriously. They want others to take God seriously because that's the best thing in their life. And so our pastors have a kind of benevolent obsession with this. So Scott Weber is a good example of this. Adam Weber, in Sioux Falls. So Adam talked about watching a mother strolling a baby in front of his house while he was sitting on the porch getting ready for a sermon or something. And he was like, oh, that's sweet. Maybe that'll be a sermon illustration. And he watches her take off her shoe and throw it at the child. And so his sermon illustration went from bucolic to painful. Like, how do we behave when we think no one's looking, right? In ways that harm the people we love most or ourselves. It's a dark world out there, y'all. And so those who are in love with the God who's always making light have to know that darkness. And we have to know it in our own hearts. So Adam feels like every time there's some catastrophe, he's like, what if I had a few minutes with that person before they went and did what they did? And it comes from an experience that a lot of pastors have had. A parishioner of his committed suicide a few hours after Adam talked to him. How you doing? Great. How are you? Fine. Everything's fine. Right? Like, it's dark in here, not just out there, right? That's the world that Christ is constantly bringing resurrection in. So the kind of single focus on reaching new people, the story I told from Jorge Acevedo is aimed at that, closing something at a huge loss because it's not reaching people in an ongoing, discipling way. Matt has this description of a lot of church work that I like a lot. He says, a lot of what we do in church is kind of good. Ouch! I just think of all the things I propped up in ministry that were kind of good. Volleyball on Tuesday night, or we got this little Bible study where it's really a social club, or like, what God needs the church for is to reach the people that don't know anything about God, right? It's not for us. None of this stuff is for us. It's all through us for other people. And the Bible has rude things to say about God's people thinking the gifts are for us. That's when you're in trouble, right? They're actually for the person you can't stand. But God has decided, the best way to get to your enemy? Through you. Off you go. So the church has to have a kind of focus on that with regard to everything we plan, fund, spend time on. Is this designed to reach the next person? The person no one thinks can be reached? And in what way are we praying about that happening? I use this so many times in the book, the copy editor made me take it out. Methodism is a revivalist sect. That's what we are. So if we're not reviving anybody, what are we there for? The Anglicans are perfectly good at doing the liturgy and putting on the costumes and the ponchos and adoring the Blessed Sacrament. We're supposed to be the crazy people out there with the people no one else wants. And we find that these pastors have that in their blood.
Yeah, I put it this way, we have to recover a sense of urgency about what the gospel does in the lives of people, and I think we've never really replaced, if we don't believe in the idea, believe in Jesus, go to heaven, don't believe in Jesus, go to hell, that's fine, but we never really replaced it with any sense of why is this urgent? Why is this an urgent question for people? And the Adam Weber example that you share, the thing he'll often say is would it have made any difference if before that shooting or before that suicide or before that parent hit their kid, would it have made any difference if I could have told them about Christ and about who Christ is and what Christ can do in your life? Would it have made any difference? And of course, we don't know if it does, but he walks around with this sense of urgency that something's actually at stake when we share Christ with people.
He's haunted by that.
Yeah, therefore, we have to, this has to be not just a thing, but the thing in our churches, that there's this sense of urgency and priority for sharing Christ with the new people. The fifth, which by the way is really hard, if we had more time to talk about it, sifting everything through that lens so that evangelism isn't just a committee, but the primary lens through which you look at everything. I ask, everybody gets tired on my staff because I ask them, how is this ministry reaching new people and sharing Christ with them? And if I say, if there's too many steps in between the ministry and the answer, we're not going to do it. Meaning, don't give me this, well, if we do this, it might do this, and then this might happen, and they might come to church. No, that's too many steps. I'm already confused. All right, virtue number 5. Rapidly growing churches elevate the practice of giving, teach tithing, effectively talk about manage money. Number one answer when we asked if you could go back earlier and do or say anything different, would you change anything? Number one answer, most frequent answer, guess what it was? Talk about money more than we did. I was afraid to talk about money early on. I didn't talk about it. And then at some point, I realized that to take out this essential element of discipleship is just going to, it's like taking your church's knees out from under it. At the very time that it starts to grow, if it's blessed with growth, all of a sudden you have to go back and fill in this massive gaping hole to people's discipleship. Otherwise, your church will just stop dead in its tracks. And I don't have to preach that too much. You all know exactly what I'm talking about, right? That when you have a new idea that's great and you want to move forward with it, what is the primary roadblock when the rubber meets the road in a church? Yeah, how much is it going to cost? Do we have the money for it? We don't have the money for it. Let's go get the money for it. Why can't we get the money for it? Oh, because people give 2.7% and that's it, or whatever it is. And so what these pastors had to recover if they didn't do it early on is that they recover an ongoing sense that giving is part of discipleship. That giving is part of what it means to follow Jesus, that we have to teach it unapologetically, we have to talk about it without fear, and we have to act as if this is actually going to benefit people's lives, not the opposite. And so the story I tell, and I'll probably step on a few toes here, I changed this. I go around and speak to a lot of new churches, and there's a practice that's developed that I'm trying to exercise out of our churches. And the practice is something like this. And now the ushers are going to pass around the basket, the offering plate, the gold, thing. They're going to pass that around, and I hope that you'll give. Now, if you're new with us this morning, we don't expect you to give. You don't have to give. Your presence is enough, or whatever it is. So just, don't do that. And we do, and that's the offering, because as the thinking goes, new people already believe all the church wants is your money. This is going to help them to like you better. First, I don't think it works. Secondly, it's bad theology. Because we don't do that with anything else. I don't stand up and say, for the next 20, really 30 minutes, I'm going to preach. And for those of you who come often, I want you to listen to, if you're new, you're probably not going to be into this, let's be honest. So just, you can pull out your phone, do what you need to do. It doesn't matter. Or we're going to pray. We're about to pray, but those of you who come to church regularly, I really hope you'll bow your heads in prayer with me. If you are new today, this isn't for you. I wouldn't do this. You can if you want, I guess, but you just sit there and look straight ahead. Not up or down. I could go on, but you get my point, right? We say it at communion, this is for... All right, do that with giving. Let's act like we actually believe in it.
Open giving.
And not like it's bad. So, yeah, let's practice an open
communion.
Open brass plate.
Of brass.
Is what I call it. Okay, I don't need to keep beating that bush, although that was fun.
That's
all right,
good.
You're up.
The problem is now that you think that way, when people do it, you'll want to run up and stop them, right? Because, it's bad. Right, so churches are more than a good preacher. They have highly effective number twos. So this chapter is really about teamwork. I think the myth of the kind of genius solo pastor hurts people in a number of ways. And one way it hurts people is it's just not true. So anybody who's successful at this, it's because there were countless other people that they did this with. And there may be other traditions that can have a kind of one-off genius. That's not a Methodist thing, actually. There's no Methodism without a little small group meeting, right? That's what made Methodist. So the example, I actually want to read a bit of the book. I know that's kind of dorky, but I think it's the best example I have. So Kelly Cisney is Scott Krostek's number two at Church of the Resurrection, downtown Kansas City. She tells of a phone call she received when Resurrection started from a man asking if they welcome people who follow alternative lifestyles. She paused. What are you, a pirate? He laughed, and he turned up Sunday and stuck around, their first member. Her skills as a former stand-up comedian come in handy. Scott Krostek is a funny man. Successful pastors often are, but he has nothing on his number two. She wasn't just successful in diffusing a phone call that could have been awkward or even a PR disaster. She diffuses radiance. Number twos have to be good gatekeepers for the number one, knowing when to involve him or her, especially when not to. Here, Cisney did more than book an appointment for the senior. She took away the need for one. She passed on the heart of the church, for it's the heart of Jesus. There's another story where Cisney and Krostek will yell at each other in meetings so that the rest of the staff has to be like, should we call someone? Should we intervene? But what it is they trust one another. And so they fight like sisters and brothers. And they'll go to one another later and say, hey, look, you hurt me when you said this. You can't talk to me that way anymore, right? Because that's what siblings do. So I think one of the dangers of boundary language in the church, I know why it's there, because we ministers, like everyone else, misbehave, is that it makes it sound like you saran wrap your soul so that it doesn't melt into someone else's soul, right? But actually, Jesus, the God of the universe in Jewish flesh, says, I've called you friends, and then washes their feet. So whatever boundary there is, the biggest one is between God and humanity, and God's already crossed it, right? So our ministry has to be marked by friendship with all the potential pain and glory and beauty and all the rest of it. And so if we try to go there without friendship, we've already failed. So we were struck at the role of the number 2 almost being more interesting than the number 1, right? Like Spock's a way more interesting character than Kirk, right? Thelma and Louise is a much better movie than Thelma. Would have been. Anyhow, like what worth doing would you ever want to do without your friends? That's the point of life.
And I think another way to think about this, and we'll talk about it with regards to even preaching, is that the bigger a church got, you realize really quickly that the genius of this place really was in multiple people coming together in a unique way to create ministry. That in a way that was almost supernatural, there were people that were willing to give away significant portions of what they thought they had to do or got to do, and it was shared. So we'll talk about it in preaching, especially because I've even since done more interviews with like very large churches, and it's incredible the degree to which preaching is a shared endeavor by a whole team of people. So we'll get into that in a second, but Virtue 7, you're up again, Jason.
RGCs know how to speak to unbelievers, outsiders, and skeptics, and are led by people who themselves can remember a time when they were far away. So some of these folks grew up in church, but they also know that they're preaching to themselves. They're trying to say, here are all the challenges of the gospel. Here are all the challenges of the world. Here the outsider skeptical person, you think you got reasons not to believe? We're in here. We got way more reasons not to believe, right? Like we know God's people intimately. Like your list is dated. I can give you a list that's from today, right? Sifting through all that, we have to honor those doubts. We can't plow over them or diminish them or say whether they're wrong or stupid. We have to show that we have honored them fully in our own lives. And then say, and you know what else? Jesus is more beautiful than any other option out there. So I thought about this for a long time, and I realized, etc. Show them your own thought trail, right? So Olu Brown at Impact says, I know how to talk to skeptics and doubters because I'm the biggest one in the room. Now, it was sort of fun. We had to send these quotes to their authors to get their permission because the lawyers and all. And Olu's assistant wrote back and said, can you give me some more context on this quote? Like, why is my pastor saying that they're the biggest doubter in the room? And I said, it's because he's such a great preacher. Right? That's a key. Not just to pass through it once, but to keep going there. All the reasons not to believe. Because, I'm going to tell you a secret, God's not scared of any of them. God is not scared of any of them. It's the church that's scared that we have to white knuckle the truth and hit people who don't have it, right? All Jesus does is open his hands and love and die for people who don't believe it, right?
When it comes to preaching, I ask myself this all the time, will this make sense to a skeptic? Have I connected the dots in a way that a skeptic could follow it? Is somebody who's indifferent or skeptical, have I met them somewhere on some kind of common ground and brought them along with me? Is there anything in this message that they can say, okay, yes, that I can buy into, now I'll follow with you? Have I established any credibility with someone who's skeptical? I mean, all these kinds of questions, because I find it's really easy for me as a Christian for a long time to write sermons that make sense to a lot of other Christians, but would... Yeah. The indifferent spouse, I usually say husbands, because in my church at least, it's mostly indifferent husbands who are drugged to church and be told to sit there. Have I done anything that might capture their imagination? So I ask myself that question a lot.
Well, and the other thing Matt and I say, we find ourselves preaching to our seminary professors. If my Bible professor walked in, would they say that I had paid sufficient attention to the historical background of the text and the Ugaritic influence on 3rd Isaiah, right? Like, they can come to church and they're important too, but that's one person in a million. You really got to preach to her grandmother and her kid who hates the church, right? So,
yeah. rapidly growing churches, I didn't include this word, I don't think
Exploit.
the benefits of a denominational system and contribute to it while mitigating the challenges
You
of
wrote that
such a
one.
system. I wrote this one, 100%. My point in saying this, and it's not just because the bishop's sitting here, this idea of pastors of churches that grow are somehow mavericks who don't, they don't fit in, they don't follow the rules, they don't like the denomination. It's really not true. Like, the more we talk to these pastors, the more that they were, they understood the benefits of being United Methodist. They saw some of the gifts that other people didn't see, especially if you start looking at like creative multi-site churches. And we have a lot of sites. Have y'all noticed that?
There's some buildings.
Like, Methodism has a lot of sites. We're well positioned for multi-site ministry. That there were partnerships and people that they could tap into that they wouldn't have if they weren't Methodist. They didn't pick fights with leaders, and they didn't look for ways to isolate themselves, but they actually contributed. They had a care, most of them, and all the ones that we interviewed. But you keep going. They had a concern and a consideration for not just their church, but something larger. And, they had to deal with challenges, but they were able to deal with those in a way that didn't cut them off. All this is a way of saying, like, when you start growing, it's really frustrating. When you're not growing, it can be really frustrating to work with people in the denomination, maybe your district superintendent, maybe your conference staff, things like that. I get all that, and it's easy for us as pastors to sit around and complain about that. But what we found in these pastors is they were also looking at, what are the real benefits of being tied together in this kind of a system, and how can we use that? So,
not least, they'll send you money.
Yes.
Churches want to plant, and there are ways to fund it through our system that you do not have by yourself as a diva and a lone ranger, right?
So we wanted to share those with you because it was in that context of learning and interviewing churches that we began to see just the role that teamwork and plays, especially as a congregation begins to get bigger, that it doesn't mean less voices, it means more voices. And even, I think, the role of ministry that we oftentimes find the most private, the most personal, the most heart-wrenching, the writing of a sermon, even that process begins to be opened up, especially in churches that are growing. So we wanted to take the second half, really, the little time we have left, to talk about specifically what did we learn and what are some of the best practices that we've seen when it comes to the preaching and teaching moment. How can that be informed not just by you, but by other people? Jason, do you want to say a few words about it?
We've got about 25 minutes left,
Yeah.
so it's really the last third here. As the preacher says, as I go to my seat, and everyone knows that's not coming for a while, right? So I'll use a Canadian example, so none of you will feel bad about that. The church I preach at a lot in Vancouver is a multi-site megachurch that's about half Asian, half everybody else. And they have this wonderful practice. So the pastor there would go home after church to lunch, and his kids would be like, hey, that was great. I'm going to tell you what you should have done different. You shouldn't have done this, and you should have had more about this, and I was wondering about this. And they'd get all this useless feedback, and he'd be like, why didn't I have that on Wednesday? It would have been a lot better sermon. So they instituted a practice they called feed forward, where if you're going to preach at 10th Church, you have to show up on Wednesday and preach to the staff and some lay people. Now, this does some things. As a preacher, it's annoying, because you're running Tuesday night specials instead of Saturday night specials, right? Like, you're up late in the middle of the week, you're up early on Wednesday, because you can't show up with nothing to say. So it moves the panic up earlier in the week. So suddenly you're like, Friday and Saturday are like, dang, I feel great. This is wonderful. I should have done this my whole life. And then here's what happened. They would inevitably say, that's a great sermon. We love it. So here's what you got to do is you got to rip out this third of it. And you got to talk about this text that's not in there now. And this person is representative of a lot of people in our church who are going to hurt when you say that. So if you're going to go there, you better go there with care. But really, we need some hope over. And you're like, I thought you liked it. Like, now it sounds like I got to start over. And they'd be like, and inevitably, it makes the sermon better. Inevitably. They were right every time. They're really smart sermon listeners. So there's a kind of fundamental humility to that says, I am not Moses going up the mountain to see God face to face, returning with my face shining with no cooperation. The point of those stories in Israel is to say Moses is not replaced. We don't even know where he's buried, right? It takes dozens of people to replace Moses. In other words, talking with God and about God requires a kind of humility, where you don't do it the way you would like to do it. You inconvenience yourself so that the whole church gets a say in what you're going to say to them about God. It'll improve your preaching. It'll make your weekend better. Your spouse will love you more. Like, trust me, this Feed Forward will have. Now, a student of mine in the United Church of Canada, which is one of the denominations my seminary serves, heard about this in our evangelical cousin and said, hey, I'm going to get some United Church ministers and we're going to totally do that. And none of them would return her call. We're not doing that. What, are you kidding? We're keeping up with the Saturday night special because our church is growing so much. Whoops. You see what I mean? So there's something to the humility of doing it the way you don't want, giving over yourself in the way God gives over God's self in Christ for the sake of the body, that I think we really have to get past the sort of, this is a thing I do by myself.
Yeah, I want to hop in here. I think as pastors, we have a lot of myths, not helpful ones, that we tell ourselves about preaching, and some of it is just because it's so hard week to week that we, to think about it critically every week, it hurts me sometimes at least. So it's easy for me to say, this is the best I've got this week. I did the best. Or, I'm just going to depend on the Holy Spirit this week. Or, to not be disciplined about our sermon writing and then to back into a theology that sort of justifies us not being attentive every week to this primary way that we impact the lives of people. So really quickly, I want to share with you some practical things that I've learned and that we've instituted at the gathering in order to share the responsibility of preaching. And I'm hoping this will be helpful to you. So we do sermon series, but I think what I'm about to say can work equally well if you preach the lectionary. You just take a chunk of the lectionary. But we plan in 6-month blocks, meaning we go away and we plan out what's the next 6 months of preaching going to look like.
And by we, you mean?
I'm going to tell you who it is in just a second,
Sorry.
Although it can be somebody different for you. But before we go away, you can already begin to involve people before you go. Whatever you do to wrap your head around what you're going to be preaching on. And I call it kind of the series development prep work. Like before we ever sit down to say, what am I going to preach on? And if it's a lectionary, that's fine too. But and here's what that includes. I do an annual survey to the congregation on my preaching. Tell me whatever you want about my preaching. There's some questions I could send you, but it's a chance for people anonymously to tell you, you talk too long every time. You say way too often, like stuff that no one maybe has ever told you. I do a congregational survey. I do feedback from, we call them core groups, that's our small group ministry, Sunday school teachers, whatever you have in your church. I every year will say, usually at the end of the academic year, were there any trends? Any questions that people regularly come back to, any struggles that you feel like came up time and time again, and I write those down. I want to know what's being talked about when we're not around, not in a way that breaks confidence, but tell me, and they'll tell me, people really struggle with prayer. Nobody wants to pray out loud, or nobody knows anything about the Bible. Or we've had like 4 families who have been damaged by addiction this year. It's just like increasing in pace. All that goes into my preaching. I think about vision and culture considerations, like sort of who do we want to be as a church? Where are the holes in who we want to be? What's missing? We say we're a church that's about X, but nobody really seems to reflect that. I write that kind of stuff down. My own study and prayer, my own sense of where God is calling our people to be. So it's not just giving people what they want or something like that, but it's taking all that into consideration. So all that's in the background. And then what we do is we go and we outline 6 months at a time what preaching is going to look like. I say we. In my church now, it's staff. It's me and it's the site pastors at our church. It doesn't have to be staff. It could be you and 3 or 4 lay people who are involved in worship, 3 or 4 people who are just really have a passion around this. It doesn't really matter if they're paid or unpaid or staff or board members or whoever they are, but you get a group and you say, we're going to go off and I want to invite you in to the mapping of what preaching is going to look like over this 6-month period. What I do.
Did you hear that ask? Wasn't that beautiful? Like, not, well, you sit on a committee that you don't really want to be on and no one's going to like, anyway, yeah, sorry.
Well, what I do is I tell them, you're not just coming to tell me whether my ideas are great or not. Each of you, in order to come, you have to develop a pitch for a series. And so they have to develop, I want you to, what is it, if you had a 4-week series that we could be preaching, what would it be? What would it be about? Why? And they each have to do pitches. And now we do 2 or 3, but they pitch, and we'll spend like a whole morning with pitches. And it's almost like, what, The Voice or American Idol or something is like, hey, that was a really, no good. Hey, that one was gold. And we circle them. And so even the kind of brainstorming, it's not just you're here to test whether or not my idea is good, but bring your ideas. We all kind of set a calendar. Hey, that would go really well, like leading up to Valentine's Day. Or, hey, have you thought about, Easter's late this year, and this sounds like a Lenten sort of series. And people start pulling in that kind of stuff. So you get what I'm talking about. I could go with more examples. Then we get to the actual, I would say the actual writing of the sermon. Here's how we include teams in that. Site pastors at our church, they'll all preach the same basic message. So we all preach the same series across our sites. The Gathering is a multi-site church. And at the beginning of the week, we get together and we say together, what's the big idea of the sermon this week? What text are we using? Where are we trying to lead people? What's the thrust of the sermon? And we do not leave that table until everyone looks at each other and says, I'm committed to that. If you have a problem with the big idea, say it now. We don't want to hear it on Sunday when you decide you wanted to go a different direction. Here's the time. And we leave that table and we agree to it. And that way, all of our sermon, and it's not even a long meeting. Big idea, scripture, where are we leading people? What are we asking them for at the end? Let's develop it together and then let's agree on it. We do this preach, what'd you call it?
Feed forward.
Feed forward, yeah. On Thursdays, on the weeks that I'm preaching, my sermon's done. At 2 o'clock, I preach it to a group of 3 to 4 people. They give me feedback on it. Pastors, this is really hard. It's gotten easier over time, but the first few times, it is so hard. It is especially hard on Christmas and Easter when I just want them to tell me it's amazing. I don't know if you do. I pour over those sermons. I'm trying so hard. I just want you to tell them. I just want you to affirm me. Please affirm me. So I will tell them beforehand. Early on, I used to tell them, I want you to know that I am actually not interested in anything that you have to say about the sermon. Let's just establish that right now, that I don't care what you think about it. But for the sake of God's mission in this church and the people that we have to subject to this sermon, you have got to tell me what you really think, okay? So just know that it hurts a little bit, but you have to tell me. And they do. And pastors, I'll tell you this, it's not that bad because I describe it this way. 9 times out of 10, and that's about the amount, I would say once a quarter, my sermon is what I call an epic meltdown. It's just bad. And there's just not really a way to salvage it. Do you know what I mean? Have you written those messages? It's just this thing is just not salvageable. It's not good. You can try to talk yourself out of it. You can try to preach it to somebody who just loves you, and it's just not good. And you just have to start over. That happens maybe once a quarter. Most of the time, 9 times out of 10, it's clarifying, getting rid of unnecessary stuff. It's the basics that you all know about. It's not like you're not a bad preacher. But hey, you told one too many stories. This part was unclear. It went on too long. What are you really trying to say? And 9 times out of 10, I can take the revisions and make them in less than an hour. And the sermon is so much better for my being willing to do something that I really hate to do.
And of course, it also bleeds over into other parts of your ministry where you show a willingness to defer to the other, even if you think they're wrong, which is also the way we should lead in general.
That's
right?
absolutely true. When I want other people, how many of you, if you have staff, part-time or full-time, how many of you wish that they would receive feedback better?
Yeah. Got to lead that way.
When you model it in the most personal thing that you do, you have a credibility to go to someone and say, I want to give you some honest feedback because that's the kind of culture we're trying to create. Just like every week, you have a chance to tell me how bad I am. I want to tell you today how bad I think you are. So no, I'm just kidding. No, I want to give you some. They're not bad.
So two examples of this that occur to me. One is Laura Hikas at Bee Creek Church in Spicewood, Texas. She inherited a model of Stewardship Sunday that we all love so much. And her way of dynamiting it was, she said, we're going to call it I Love My Church Sunday. And I'm going to have people get up and talk about how their lives were changed. Now, her job just got a lot harder because she just became a preaching coach to 8 or 10 lay people to whom she had to give feedback on the most important story in their lives. But you can't let people go up there without going through that, actually. They'll say things they shouldn't say. They don't know. You've paid the stupid tax, and so you know you can't say this or that, right? But it is amazing, she says, that preaching is actually another thing you're giving away, right? I mean, we're a tradition that believes in testimony because we think God is constantly changing lives. So if we hog the microphone, we demonstrate something else, that God's word is only for like the people with master's degrees in this stuff, right? So that's one example. Another most famous moment of oratory in American history is, of course, the I Have a Dream speech. And a couple of things I love about this. King preached a version of that for 10 years before he needed it on the Washington Mall. He pulled it out, he polished it, he put it back in his pocket, he got used to it. It was his go-to move if you're an athlete. He didn't even come up with it. A young woman prayed it over a church that burned in Georgia. And he heard it. So in other words, we have to be good with the ear. We don't have to be geniuses at creating everything, but we have to notice that's gorgeous. I want that. Nobody knows who this young woman was. They haven't been able to figure out who this prayer was. It's known to God. So King is on the mall. He's over time. They're bored, and he's bored. In the most famous speech in American history. And Mahalia Jackson behind him says, "Tell him about the dream, Martin." And he pivots into ad-libbing the most important moment in the most important speech in our country's history. But it wasn't ad-lib from nothing. It was practiced and practiced and practiced. So the more you practice, the better you can innovate, the better you can go off script, right? Practicing is the key, actually, to spontaneity.
I'm going to say a word to those of you how many of you preach every week, basically? Yeah, a lot of you, other locations, probably a lot of us. This practice, if you can do it, and it sounds impossible to get your sermon done by Thursday and preach it to a group on Thursday afternoon. It has absolutely transformed my life on the weekend, my personal life. I really mean that. This is not hyperbole. I take a Friday off, and I truly take it off because my sermon is done. I don't mean kind of done. I don't mean the ideas are basically there, the things that I used to tell myself about my sermon that was a lie. It's done. Like I've preached it, I revise it, and then in my case, I go into the sanctuary and I record it. I preach it to an empty room, I record it, and that's what goes to our sites. So it's that done. Slides are done. Everything's done. And it has absolutely changed my life on Friday and Saturday. I have 3 kids. They have soccer game. Before, I was the worst at being present and not really being present. My mind was on the message. Do you guys have that? Your mind's on the message. And, I'm there, but I'm really thinking about how I kind of got to get back. I need like an hour in front of that computer just to kind of clean things up. It's I have something Saturday night at dinner. I got to get home because it's done, pretty much done, but, I need an ending and a beginning and some better points in
Several
between.
illustrations.
Other than that, it's basically there. And I don't know how many times I used to do that. Sunday morning, I'm at church stressing out, printing it out, looking at it. That doesn't really seem to work. Scratching it out, printing it back out. I'm in my office when I could have been out, connecting with people. I mean, it has transformed my life. And I thought it was impossible. It is the most beautiful gift I've given myself, is forcing me to be accountable to other people whose voice speaks into it, and that has forced me to get it done, and it's absolutely made me a happier human being, a better husband and dad, and just all around, I like my job a lot more, and I think I could do it for longer, because I was dying on the vine the other way of doing it, which I did for a long time. So that's just my personal pitch to, I know it seems impossible, but if you can find a way to get that thing done, invite some other people to give you feedback, use their revisions, and have that sometime before the weekend, I promise you, it will absolutely change the way you experience weekends in your life.
You remind me of the questions I would get from Baptist neighbors when I pastored in North Carolina. You really believe in infant baptism? You really believe in women in ministry? I'd be like, believe? Hell, I've seen it.
Yeah.
Believe you can get your sermon done on Tuesday night?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. I've seen it. It doesn't take a miracle. I did it last week. And I just want to amen. That's just spot on.
And I want to add, I do want to say that I think, here's the beauty of it. as much as it hurts or it's hard maybe to hear feedback or to invite people in on the process, nobody in the congregation really knows. It just makes you look so much better than you really are. I mean, that's the beauty of it. And when we look at some of these large churches, especially really large churches, they are masters at looking better than they actually are. And I don't mean inauthenticity, which is a problem in some places, but I mean authentically, like behind the scenes, there are people doing sermon research. There are people who are filling up a bin of stories for them to use. There are people telling them every week, like, when you wear that shirt, it looks weird and it's distracting, and you say too much, and you just have this tick of looking at your notes. I mean, whatever it is. And they have a whole army of people behind them. And when you open yourselves up to some of that, it just makes you look so much better. You learn so much more quickly. I preached for 10 years without ever really getting honest, timely, direct feedback. And I lament how good I could have gotten over that 10 years if I just would have opened myself up to other people in the process. So that's just a pitch. Don't just do it with preaching. I try to share now teaching and other elements of upfront leadership, because I just think it makes for a better church that's less dependent on me. There's some spiritual disciplines that we probably don't have time to get into, but like humility, dealing with jealousy. I mean, I think if you have a church that's large enough to have another preacher, an associate or part-time or something like that, you ought to pray for a person who's a really great speaker. Yeah. But all of us as pastors, you let that other person speak, and you inevitably hear like, that was a great message. They did such a good job.
Why aren't you
That's
that
the
good?
best sermon I've heard in years. I mean, they'll say things like that, and you're just thinking like, God, that's just a sign that you're preaching too much. I mean, really, it really is just a sign that you're preaching just too much. It's not a sign that you're a bad preacher.
Yeah, one
so
sign
you don't have to be afraid of that.
Of preaching and humility is if somebody doesn't too zealously guard their pulpit. So a lot of megachurch pastors will preach 50 Sundays a year. It's just not good for you or for the church. So one thing I like about this church tent that I go to is senior pastor's in the pulpit 25 times a year, because he's spending the rest of the time, he has guests like us, but he's also inviting people in who don't have that opportunity, right? And encouraging them and coaching them and going over their sermon afterwards with them and saying, here's some stuff you should do more of. This is beautiful. An art teacher taught a friend of mine how to paint by just saying, okay, go paint. Here's the stuff. And then it was a mess. And then he would say, hey, look at this 1 by 1 inch postage stamp sized part of this. This is really good. Make that the whole painting. And then he'd start over, right? The other thing on receiving criticism, Lauren Winter gets this from an art critic. When this art critic gets a piece of art that they hate, but they just have to think of something nice, they make themselves say, what would I like about this painting if I liked anything about this painting? Which I don't, right? So that gives you a little psychological space to be clear you don't like any of it. I try to do that with criticism, like with whatever criticism, friendly, unfriendly, fair, unfair, because then it allows you to learn from whatever thing is in the criticism that's true. Even if 95% of it's garbage and keeps you up at night, there's always some unexpected gift, even in the rudest, I'm afraid. Maybe not always, that's too strong, but you get my point. I just hate criticism. It keeps me up at night. I say I miss everything about the local parish except the evening meetings and the cheap shots. But you have to figure out a posture where you can receive it as gift and then pivot into it in a way that shows that you've received it as gift. Because if you just shield it, then it'll stop coming, and that's much worse, actually. That means they're not bought into what you're doing in a way that's committed to making you better.
Yeah, I'm just going to, just kind of the last thing I'll say. I preach, realistically, I think, when it comes to the amount that we preach and kind of the thing that I was just talking about before, like I've fallen into a pattern of preaching 38 to 40 times a year. Less than that feels a little unrealistic, like in my church. More than that starts to feel like it's a lot of me and less of them. I was, until probably 5 years ago, preaching about 49 to 50 times. It was like 2 weeks of vacation and youth Sunday or something like that. I mean, it was like every Sunday I was up there. And so, and you know what you'll find is even most big church, mega churches, sometimes they have pastors who hold on tightly to the pulpit, but most of the time they don't. Most of the time they preach shockingly low amounts. Like, I don't know, think of some big Andy Stanley, I think, preaches like less than 35 times a year.
Yeah, you feel lucky if
I mean,
you show up in New York and Tim Keller's in the pulpit.
Yeah, Tim Keller. I mean, so this idea that if it's not us, somehow we're going to lose people.
Yeah.
I mean, Methodist churches are really hard to grow, but they also are surprisingly difficult to kill when you want to kill them too. So you don't have to be like so afraid that you're going to, I mean, they're
about this?
surprisingly resilient creatures. I mean, it's like, and it's just alive again. And so, I mean, they're going to survive
if you're not there.
Preaching 50 times a year. But, yeah.
So we're not doing Q&A in this session, but I see from your faces you have some. So we'd love to talk to you at lunch, and but I think we're about out of time.
I think we should be done.
Thank you. When you preach, always leave them wishing you were still talking.
Right,
we may have passed that point a long time ago.
So thank you all very much. It was good to be here.